For 15 years, Eli Turner hadn't spoken to another living soul longer than a few words. He'd built his world out of fences, wood wire, and silence, and for a long time it felt safer that way. But that winter morning, something happened that would remind him that silence, no matter how thick, can still be broken by the sound of a living heart. Eli's ranch sat at the edge of nowhere, a stretch of northern Arizona land where the soil turned red beneath your boots, and the horizon stretched wider than memory itself. Out here, mornings had a certain weight. You could hear the whisper of pine trees, the sigh of old barns settling into the cold. Eli liked that kind of quiet. It wasn't loneliness, at least not the way people meant it. It was an order, predictable. He woke before dawn, started the coffee on the wood stove, and watched the steam rise like a ghost escaping. Same chair, same chipped mug, same silence. The fence that wrapped around his land had been there since his father's time. Eli had mended it so often it felt like stitching an old wound, each new board, another attempt to keep something out, or maybe to keep himself in. He'd stopped counting the years since the accident. That's how he referred to it, the accident, though sometimes in the dark he called it by its real name, his son's name. There were days he thought the world had ended right there on that dirt road, that the man who lived after wasn't really Eli anymore, just a shadow, wearing his boots, feeding his horses, and waiting for time to do what it promised to everyone. That morning was supposed to be like any other. The air hung cold, thin enough to bite. Eli took his coffee and stepped out to the porch. The boards groaned under his weight. The sky was pale, a bruised blue before dawn. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called once, twice, then went silent again. He leaned against the post and listened to the stillness. He could almost convince himself that nothing had changed. Almost. Then he heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the land, not wind, not coyote. Something softer. A low, strangled cry carried by the cold air. Eli froze. Sound had become such a stranger to him that it took a moment to understand what it was. Not quite human, not quite animal. Something between. He set the cup down on the rail, his hand trembling slightly, and walked toward the fence. The sun was just starting to climb when he saw it, a young bobcat caught in the corner of the wire. Her fur, the color of winter grass, clung to the frost. Her sides rose and fell too fast. One paw was twisted in the wire blood, dark against the snow. Eli had seen bobcats before. They came down from the hills now and then, lean and wild, curious about the horses. But this one was different. She wasn't fighting the trap, she was shivering, watching him with wide, wet eyes. He stopped 10 feet away, every instinct telling him not to interfere. Wild things have their own laws. You don't cross them unless you're ready to pay the price. But there was something in the way she looked at him. Not aggression, not even fear. Just exhaustion, the kind that comes when you've been hurt too many times to fight anymore. And in that stillness, Eli felt something shift. He remembered another pair of eyes, smaller, human. The last thing he saw before the crash. His son's hand slipping from his own. The air in his chest tightened. He knelt slowly, hands open as if approaching a wounded child. The bobcat hissed, but weakly. Her paw twitched. The wire had cut deep, nearly to the bone. "I know," he whispered, his voice breaking on the words. "I know, girl. Hold still." He reached for the pliers he always carried on his belt. The metal clinked softly. With each twist, the wire gave way. When the paw came free, she didn't run. She just stared at him, breathing hard, trembling alive. Eli sat there in the dirt for a long while, the cold seeping through his knees. The bobcat limped a few steps, stopped, then looked back. He expected her to vanish into the trees, but instead she crouched near the fence as if unsure whether to leave or stay. In that fragile moment, Eli realized something he hadn't felt in years: responsibility. Not obligation, that old heavy kind he'd lived with his whole life. No, this was different, a quieter pull. He looked at the blood on his gloves, the faint steam rising from her wound. He thought about how easily life bleeds out when no one's watching. It wasn't pity that stirred him. It was recognition. The way she flinched, the way she watched him with mistrust and longing, it was how he'd looked at the world for 15 years. suspicious of kindness, afraid it might hurt more than the silence ever did. He walked back to the house, filled a bowl with water, and set it near the fence line. When he returned to the porch, she was still there, drinking. For the first time in so long, Eli didn't feel entirely alone. People think solitude brings peace, and for a while it can. But after too many winters alone, peace turns heavy like snow piling on an old roof. It doesn't crash all at once. It sags slowly, quietly, until one day it just gives way. Eli never meant to isolate himself. It started small, one missed call, one letter left unopened, one neighbor he waved to from too far away. Then years passed and loneliness became a habit. But that morning, looking at the small, trembling shape by his fence, he realized that silence wasn't safety anymore. It was just another kind of pain. He found himself whispering again, maybe to her, maybe to himself. "You don't belong here, girl." "Neither do I." The bobcat lifted her head, eyes glinting in the light. Something passed between them, not language but recognition. Two wounded creatures both learning that survival isn't the same as living. The sun rose higher, spilling gold over the frozen fields. The bobcat disappeared into the tree line, her tracks cutting a fragile path through the snow. Eli stood by the fence, staring after her. For the first time in 15 years, he wondered if silence could break in more ways than one. He didn't know it yet, but that cry, the one that tore through the morning, was the start of everything that would follow. It was the sound that would bring the world back to his door. Have you ever built a fence so high, even kindness couldn't reach you? Stay with me, because sometimes what crosses that fence can change everything. He thought silence was safety. But that cry, the one that came from beyond the fence, had a way of lingering like a question that refused to be ignored. The next morning broke colder than the last. The frost on the porch rail looked like salt on the edge of the world. Eli Turner wrapped his hands around his coffee cup, the steam rising into the pale dawn. The land was quiet again. Too quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet he once cherished, but the kind that waits. The kind that listens back. He told himself the bobcat had gone that wild. Things didn't stay near people for long. They came, they healed, they disappeared. That was nature's law, clean, unburdened, final. Still, he found himself walking toward the fence, coffee in one hand, pliers in the other. The snow around the wire had been disturbed. He saw paw prints, small, precise, leading toward the trees. A streak of dried blood marked the trail. He crouched by the fence post, fingers brushing the wire he'd untangled yesterday. A patch of fur still clung there. The faint scent of wild earth and iron. "She made it," he murmured to no one, though a part of him wanted to believe she'd heard it. Eli had always prided himself on not needing anyone. People were noisy. People were promised things they didn't keep. Out here, the only thing he answered to was the wind and the sound of his own boots in the dirt. But as he stood there, the image of the bobcat, her trembling, her eyes wouldn't fade. He found himself listening for her again, scanning the ridge where the pines thickened. Every crack of ice, every flutter of crow wings made his chest tighten just a little. Around noon, while chopping firewood near the barn, he heard it again, a low, guttural cry. This time, weaker rawweir. He dropped the axe. The sound came from near the creek bed, a place he hadn't visited in years. The ground there was uneven, slick with frost. He followed the noise, a heart heavy with something he didn't recognize at first, fear maybe, or hope. When he reached the creek, he saw her again. The bobcat was crouched under a fallen log, sides heaving. She'd tried to walk, but the wound had opened again. Blood matted her fur. But what caught Eli's attention wasn't the injury. It was her eyes. They weren't wild anymore. They were pleading. Eli approached slowly. "It's okay," he whispered, voice steady but soft. "You're all right, girl. Easy now." He laid his coat on the ground and knelt beside her. The air was sharp with cold and iron. He could feel her breath, quick, shallow, uneven. She flinched when he reached out, claws twitching. Then, after a long moment, she stopped resisting. The trust wasn't full, but it was enough. Using a strip of cloth from his sleeve, Eli pressed against the wound, keeping the bleeding down. The contact made the bobcat tremble, but she didn't pull away. "There," he said quietly. "You're tougher than you look." He lifted her carefully as if carrying something sacred and began the long walk back to the ranch. Each step was deliberate. The cold bit into his hands, but he didn't loosen his grip. He could feel the fragile rhythm of her heart against his chest, fast, uneven, stubbornly alive. When he reached the barn, he set her down near the hay and wrapped her in an old wool blanket. The horses stirred but didn't panic. Even they seemed to understand something fragile was unfolding. It had been years since Eli had touched another living creature like this. Not since the day he'd held his son's hand for the last time. And here he was again, holding something broken, trying to keep it alive. The thought made him pause. For so long, he'd believed isolation was protection, a wall built against pain. But as he sat in the dim barn light, watching the rise and fall of the bobcat's chest, he realized that solitude hadn't saved him from loss. It had only kept it echoing. There was a strange comfort in tending to another being. It demanded presence. No past, no future. Just the small immediate act of care, cleaning the wound, offering water, waiting. When she stirred, Eli whispered, "You don't owe me anything, girl. Just rest." The barn was quiet, except for the sound of soft breathing, his and hers. Fear, Eli thought, isn't always about danger. Sometimes it's about memory. About what your body remembers even when your mind tries to forget. He'd seen fear take many forms in the horses during storms, in his own reflection after the accident. It didn't always roar. Sometimes it just sat, quietly hidden under routine. That bobcat, she wasn't just hurt. She was remembering pain. Every sound, every movement carried the ghost of something that had tried to kill her, and maybe in some way, he was the same. The way he avoided town, the way he never picked up the phone, all of it came from a wound that never stopped aching. Yet now, looking at her, this wild, trembling creature lying in his care, he saw something different. Fear was survival once, but it wasn't meant to be a home. Outside, the wind began to rise. The trees bent and whispered against each other. A dusting of snow swept across the field, soft and slow, like the world exhaling. Through the open barn door, Eli could see the fence stretching into the distance, the same fence that had stood as his boundary line between himself and everything else. He thought about how strange it was that life had found a way through anyway. He reached out, touched the edge of the blanket, and said quietly, "Guess we're both learning how to stay." The bobcat blinked, eyes heavy but alert, as if understanding. That night, Eli didn't sleep in his bed. He stayed in the barn, seated beside her, keeping the lantern low. Occasionally, she'd stir, stretch, and make a faint sound. He'd murmur something back. Not words of comfort, so much as acknowledgement. There was peace in it, the simple rhythm of two living beings existing side by side. He thought about his son again, about how much of life had been spent trying to undo one mistake instead of simply living what was left. The world outside the barn seemed far away. Inside there was warmth, breath, and the soft sound of survival. By morning, the bleeding had stopped. The bobcat lifted her head, weak but steady, and looked toward the open door where sunlight spilled in. Eli knew she'd leave soon. Wild things always do. But this time, the thought didn't bring emptiness. It brought something quieter, gratitude. He stood and opened the barn door wider. "Go on," he said softly. "The world's still waiting for you." She limped to the threshold, paused, and glanced back once. A single moment of stillness between two souls that understood each other without words. Then she slipped into the light. Eli watched until the fields swallowed her shape. He stayed at the doorway for a long time, the cold biting through his sleeves, and thought about the strange grace of being needed even for a moment. Sometimes what we save isn't just the wounded thing in front of us, it's the part of ourselves we thought was gone for good. Stay with me, because the next sound that breaks the silence will change Eli's life, and maybe the way you see your own quiet too. For most people, silence is a pause, a breath between words. But for Eli Turner, silence had become a way of life. So when he finally spoke again, even to a bobcat, it sounded strange in the air, like an old instrument learning its tune. It had been 3 days since the bobcat left the barn. 3 mornings since her tracks disappeared into the snow beyond the fence line. Eli still caught himself looking for her shadow near the tree line, half expecting those golden eyes to appear again between the pines. They didn't. But her absence didn't bring the old kind of emptiness. It brought something new, a hum of restlessness, quiet but alive. He tried to fall back into his old routines, feeding the horses, splitting firewood, checking the fence. Yet each task felt different, slower, as though his body remembered something his mind hadn't yet caught up to the act of caring. That afternoon, while fixing a section of wire, he caught himself speaking out loud. Just a few words at first. "That'll hold," he muttered, testing the post. The sound startled him. He hadn't heard his own voice in so long that it came out low and hoarse, like gravel turning in the throat. He paused, then laughed softly, the kind of small laugh that feels foreign and familiar all at once. The next morning, he did it again, this time intentionally. He started talking to the animals. It wasn't a conversation, not really. Just pieces of thought spoken into the open air. "You're looking strong today," he told one of the horses. "You and me both need a good stretch of sunshine." The horse flicked its ear as if listening. Eli smiled. Later, while tending the chicken coop, he caught himself saying, "She'll come back, you know, the bobcat." Wild things don't always run from kindness. He didn't know if he believed that, but saying it aloud made the idea real, even if only for a breath. In the evenings, he found himself standing by the fence, the same one where it all began. He'd bring a bowl of water, sometimes leftover scraps, setting them gently by the post. Then he'd talk softly, not expecting an answer. He talked about the weather, about the fence, about the way the light hit the canyon at sunset. And somewhere between those words, the weight he'd carried for 15 years started to loosen. You don't realize how heavy silence becomes until you finally let it go. Eli had spent so long believing that speaking was pointless, that words couldn't change the past, couldn't bring his son back, couldn't undo the accident. But maybe words weren't meant to fix anything. Maybe they were meant to remember. He thought of all the people he'd stopped calling his sister, the old neighbor who used to drop by with fresh bread, the preacher who left notes at his gate, until one day he stopped. Each name rose like dust in his mind, settling gently back into place. He whispered their names into the quiet, not as prayer, not as apology, just acknowledgement. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel the sting of guilt when he spoke them. The bobcat had taught him that much. You can live in silence so long that you start mistaking it for peace. But peace without connection is just another word for hiding. Isolation isn't always loneliness. Sometimes it's survival, a way to control the one thing that doesn't leave you. Eli knew that better than anyone. After the accident, the silence felt safe. No one to lose, no one to disappoint. Just him, his land, and the rhythm of routine. But what he hadn't noticed, what so many who live alone don't, is how silence reshapes you. How it steals your language. He realized it while trying to speak to the horses. Words came slowly, uncertainly, like stones drawn from the bottom of a creek. He'd forgotten the texture of conversation, when to pause, when to breathe, when to laugh. In the quiet, his world had grown smaller than he intended. And yet this wild creature, a wounded bobcat of all things, had reopened a door he didn't even remember closing. There are people all across this country who live like Eli. Not in ranches or barns, but in small apartments, quiet homes, backyards where the world has stopped knocking. They say it's peace, and maybe it is. But sometimes peace can sound a lot like the absence of purpose. When Eli spoke again, even just to himself, he wasn't performing an act of courage. He was performing an act of remembering. Remembering that a voice, no matter how cracked or tired, still matters. That sound can be proof of life. We all carry that need tucked somewhere deep to be heard, even if only by the wind or a barn cat, or the echo of our own words. One evening just before dusk, Eli heard a rustle near the fence. He looked up and froze. There, a familiar shape half hidden by the brush. The bobcat, her limp barely noticeable now. She stood for a long moment watching him. Eli didn't move. Then, almost casually, she walked along the fence line and sat, tail wrapped around her paws. The distance between them was the same as before, but something in the air had changed. He didn't say anything right away, just watched her in the fading light. Then, quietly, he said, "You found your way back." The sound of his own voice felt steady this time. Full. The bobcat blinked once, slow and deliberate, before slipping into the shadows. Eli stayed by the fence long after she was gone. And though the land was silent again, he realized it wasn't the same kind of silence. This one felt alive, filled with possibility. The wilderness around him had begun to soften. The same cold wind that once felt like punishment now brushed against him like forgiveness. Evening light turned the fields gold. The air smelled of pine and thawing soil. Somewhere in the hills, an owl called out a sound both lonely and comforting. Eli understood now nature had never been punishing him for his grief. It had just been waiting for him to listen. That night, as he lay in bed, Eli left the window open. He wanted to hear the night sounds, the wind, the shifting branches, maybe even the distant cry of a bobcat. Sleep came easily for the first time in years. And when the morning came, the sound that woke him wasn't silence. It was footsteps on the path leading to his ranch. Not the soft tread of an animal, but the distinct rhythm of a person approaching. Someone was coming, and Eli's world, so carefully walled off, was about to open wider than he'd planned. Sometimes the first voice we rediscover isn't our own. It's the world whispering back. Stay with me, because the next person who steps beyond Eli's fence will test everything he's learned about fear, kindness, and what it means to live among the living again. Eli Turner had spent years believing the world had forgotten him. But that evening, when a stranger rode up the path, as the sun sank behind the ridge, he realized something simple yet terrifying. It was never the world that left him. It was he who had left the world. The sky that evening was painted in soft strokes, violet melting into gold, the kind of sunset you'd forget to photograph because standing there felt holy enough. Eli was mending a section of the fence when he heard the sound of a horse's slow, uneven gait. The creak of saddle leather, the rhythm of hooves meeting frozen soil. He stiffened. It had been years since anyone had come down his road. Mail stopped arriving long ago. The only tracks near his land belonged to deer, and foxes, never people. He turned toward the sound, his hand instinctively brushing the brim of his hat, not out of politeness, but to block the glare. Through the fading light, a rider came into view. A woman, shoulders squared against the cold, her horse breathing clouds into the dusk. She slowed as she reached the gate, her voice carrying easily across the quiet. "Evening. You Eli Turner?" Eli nodded once, guarded. "Depends who's asking." She introduced herself as Claire Mason, said she lived on the other side of the ridge, ran a small rescue for lost and injured animals. One of her dogs, a hound named Scout, had gone missing 2 nights earlier. "Someone told me he might have wandered this way," she said, glancing around the property. Eli shook his head. "Haven't seen a hound, just the usual, foxes, coyotes, a bobcat or 2. At that, her eyes narrowed slightly. "A bobcat? You sure?" He hesitated. "Fairly sure." "Careful," she said softly. "They don't usually linger unless something is keeping them close. You've got livestock that can turn bad fast." Eli nodded but said nothing more. She couldn't have known the full truth that the bobcat had already been inside his barn, resting under his care. As she spoke, the wind lifted her scarf, carrying the scent of cedar and campfire smoke, a smell that tugged at something deep in Eli's memory. When she finally dismounted, he noticed the wear on her gloves, the way she looked at the land, not as a stranger, but as someone who understood what living close to it demanded. "I'll check near the creek," she said. "That's where dogs go when they're scared." Eli hesitated, then pointed north. "There's an old game trail just past the ridge. Might find tracks there. It's muddy though, better light in the morning." She studied him for a moment. "You know this place well?" He gave a small nod. "Lived here most of my life. The land remembers more than I do." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the sky dim. Somewhere nearby, an owl called. The sound of it filled the space between them, not uncomfortable, just real. Claire smiled faintly. "You've got quiet company out here." Eli's reply came slowly. "Quiet's cheaper than people." She laughed gently, the sound soft and genuine. "Maybe, but it costs more than you think." Eli looked away, pretending to tighten the fence wire, though his chest felt tight. It had been so long since someone had spoken to him without hurry, without purpose. When she mounted her horse again, he found himself saying something he hadn't planned. "That creek, if you head there tomorrow, the trail splits near a pine stump. Stay right. Left'll take you nowhere good." She met his gaze, the corners of her mouth lifting. "Thanks, I'll remember that." Then she turned and rode toward the ridge, the sound of hooves fading into the gathering night. After she left, the quiet settled again, but it wasn't the same. Eli stood by the fence hand, still resting on the pliers. The air felt charged, like something had been disturbed, not broken, but awakened. He looked out toward the darkening trees and thought of her words, "Quiet costs more than you think." She was right. Silence, he realized, wasn't free. It had cost him laughter companionship, the gentle give and take of conversation. It had cost him the sound of another person saying his name without pity or obligation. He'd spent 15 years hoarding his quiet like gold, only to find it had bought him nothing but echoes. There's a certain pride that comes with being self-reliant, the kind that runs deep in people like Eli, people of the land. But pride left unchecked can become armor. And armor keeps out more than pain, it keeps out warmth too. Eli thought about how long he'd worn his silence like protection, each year without visitors. Each fence repair done alone, each meal eaten in wordless routine. All of it had been proof that he didn't need the world anymore. But standing there, watching the last light fade, he felt the first crack in that belief. Maybe the world still needed him in ways he hadn't yet understood. Many people live like Eli without meaning to, not on ranches or in cabins, but in quiet rooms where the phone never rings and the mailbox stays empty. We tell ourselves we're fine alone, that silence is peace. But sometimes peace is just the sound of a life growing smaller. Connection doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it rides in at dusk. Asks a simple question and leaves you wondering why your heart feels different after it's gone. That night the sky cleared, revealing a spill of stars so bright it made the snow glow faintly blue. Eli sat on the porch, listening to the night sounds, the distant river, the whisper of pine needles in the wind. Somewhere out there a dog barked once, then went quiet. He thought of the bobcat again, the way she'd looked back before disappearing. Then of Claire, her voice steady and kind. Both had come into his world uninvited. Both had left something behind. Maybe that was how the world worked. It didn't knock. It just entered where there was space. When morning came, the first light poured over the ridge, gilding the fence line. Eli stepped outside, coffee in hand, scanning the horizon out of habit. That's when he saw her again. Claire Mason riding slowly up the trail. But she wasn't alone. Running beside her horse, muddy and panting, was a brown hound with a torn ear and wagging tail. And just behind them, along the edge of the woods, a flash of movement, the bobcat watching. The wild and the tame, side by side, returning to the same place. Eli smiled, small, quiet, but real. He didn't know it yet, but that morning would mark the beginning of something he thought he'd lost forever: belonging. Sometimes the people who appear at dusk are the ones who bring back the light. Stay with me, because what happens next will show how one act of kindness, one unexpected return, can change not just a life, but the rhythm of a heart learning to trust again. Storms have a way of revealing what's fragile. Not just fences or trees, but hearts that have forgotten how to bend. That night, as thunder rolled across the valley, Eli Turner would learn that some walls fall not because of wind, but because of mercy. The storm arrived before sundown, the kind that changes the color of the sky, turning everything the shade of old bruises. The wind picked up first, sweeping through the pines with a low hum that set the horses pacing. Eli could feel it coming hours before the first drop fell. Years on the land had taught him to listen for the shift, the stillness before the rush, the way birds vanished from sight. He went about his routine as he always did, tightening shutters, checking the barn doors, setting lanterns along the windowsills. But even as he worked, he caught himself glancing toward the woods. The memory of that wild bobcat Luna he'd started calling her still lingered. He hadn't seen her for several days, but every so often he'd find fresh prints near the creek. "Stay safe, girl," he murmured to the empty field. "Storm's a bad one tonight." The wind answered, bending the tall grass flat. By nightfall, the first lightning struck across the ridge. The sound was instant, a crack that tore through the silence like an old wound reopening. Rain followed, hard and relentless drumming on the roof, turning the yard into rivers of mud. Eli stood on the porch, coat pulled tight, watching sheets of water blur the world into motion. There was beauty in it, the fierce kind, the kind that reminds you how small you really are. He turned to go back inside when a sharp cry pierced through the noise. It wasn't the wind. He froze. Another cry came, faint but distinct, carried by the storm, somewhere near the north fence. Without thinking, Eli grabbed his lantern and stepped into the rain. The cold hit like a shock, slicing through his coat. Lightning flared, illuminating the land in flashes, fence posts, trees, then something small and moving near the old oak. He ran. The mud pulled at his boots, but he didn't stop until he reached the sound. There, tangled in a fallen branch, was Luna, her fur slicked to her skin, her body curled protectively around two tiny shapes. Kittens. Eli knelt beside her, heart pounding harder than the thunder. The kittens mewled softly, eyes still closed. Luna raised her head weakly, blood streaking one paw where the branch had pinned her. All right, he said softly, voice trembling but calm. We'll get you out. He lifted the branch carefully, freeing her leg. She didn't fight him, just looked at him, trusting, exhausted. He could feel her body shaking under his hands. It hit him. Then she hadn't just survived. She'd been protecting. In the middle of the storm, with the world crashing around her, she'd stayed with her young. Eli swallowed hard. Come on, girl. Let's get you home. He gathered her and the kittens against his chest, wrapping them in his coat, and started the long walk back. The rain blinded him, wind, pushing from every direction, but he pressed on. He thought of the night 15 years ago when the world had gone dark for him. The crash, the storm, the sirens. How he'd blamed himself for not saving what he couldn't save. And now here he was, carrying something fragile again through the chaos. It felt like the land was giving him a second chance. When he finally reached the barn, he laid them down on the old blanket near the hay, the same spot where she'd rested before. The lantern light flickered across her fur, across the tiny bodies pressed close to her. Eli sat nearby, drenched, shaking from cold and relief. The sound of the storm outside was deafening, but inside it was different, steady, almost rhythmic. He watched her for a long while. The way she licked the kittens clean, the way her breathing slowed, the way her eyes, heavy with pain, still softened when she looked at them. It was the purest kind of love, the kind that doesn't speak, doesn't promise, doesn't ask for anything back. Just stays. Something in that broke him open. He'd spent half his life running from the ache of losing love, trying to convince himself that needing anyone was a weakness. But watching this wounded creature guard her young as the storm raged outside, he understood something simple and true. Love was never a weakness. It was the reason we survived the storms at all. As the thunder faded into distant rumbles, Eli thought about how pain passes down, not always in blood, but in silence. Luna's fear wasn't just from traps or storms. It was the instinct of a creature who'd learned that the world could turn cruel in a heartbeat. He recognized that look because he'd worn it himself. He thought of his son again, of how the boy used to run barefoot through this same field, chasing the barn cats, until they vanished into the brush. How laughter once lived here. Pain had silenced that laughter. And in choosing to isolate himself, Eli had passed the silence on not to another person, but to the land, to everything that had once been alive around him. Now, with this small family trembling under his care, he felt something healing, not just in them, but in him. Maybe redemption doesn't arrive as forgiveness. Maybe it arrives as responsibility, as a second chance to protect what's still innocent in the world. Outside, the storm began to ease. The rain slowed, the wind softened. The air inside the barn grew still, filled with the warmth of breath and straw. Eli leaned back against the post, exhaustion settling over him like a heavy blanket. Through the cracked door, a pale light began to rise, the first sign of dawn. The storm had passed, but it had left its mark. Branches scattered puddles, gleaming, the earth reshaped. He smiled faintly. "We made it," he whispered. Luna stirred, eyes half closed, a low purr rumbling through her chest. The kittens, blind to everything but warmth, pressed closer. For the first time in years, Eli felt that same instinct not to hide, not to escape, but to protect. To care for something that needed him. And maybe he thought that was what being alive really meant. When morning fully broke, the land glistened under a clean sky. The air smelled of wet earth and pine. Eli stepped outside, stretching his stiff shoulders, and looked toward the ridge. The storm had stripped away the weak branches and left the strong ones shining. He thought of Claire Mason somewhere beyond those hills, probably checking her rescue pens, counting her animals, wondering how the night had gone. He made a quiet decision then to tell her about Luna, about the kittens, about the fence line that had started this whole thing. Because maybe some storms aren't meant to destroy. Maybe they're meant to open the door for someone else to step through. Sometimes the fiercest storms bring the gentlest beginnings. Stay with me, because the visitor who returns after the rain will bring light into Eli's world in ways he never saw coming. Some visits begin with a knock. Others begin with silence, the kind that carries warmth instead of warning. A week after the storm, Eli Turner learned that not all visitors come to take. Some arrive to remind you you're not alone anymore. The land was still drying after the storm. Puddles shimmered like broken glass under the pale morning sun. The air smelled of pine sap and renewal. Eli stood at the edge of the barn, watching Luna stretch in a shaft of light. Her paw had healed enough for her to move without limping, though she stayed close to her two kittens, who tumbled and played in the hay. He smiled faintly. "You're doing all right?" he said softly, leaning on the post. "We all are." It had been years since those words had felt true, years since his home had held any sound but the wind. But now there was a heartbeat in every corner of the place, a pulse of life returning. He'd even started talking to the kittens, naming them Cedar and Fern. "Don't get too comfortable," he warned with a grin one morning. "You'll have to learn to be wild again." But as he said it, part of him knew he was the one relearning how to live. One afternoon, while cleaning the trough near the fence, he heard the familiar rhythm of hoofbeats, steady, unhurried. He turned to see Claire Mason riding toward him, her hat pulled low, a small smile tugging at the edge of her face. Behind her trotted Scout, the hound she'd found after the storm, tail wagging coat slick with sunlight. Eli wiped his hands on his jeans. Didn't expect company. Claire dismounted, tying her reins loosely. "Figured I owed you a visit," she said. "Storm like that, I wanted to make sure you made it through." "I made it," he said simply, though there was gratitude behind the words. She glanced toward the barn. "Heard some rumors down at the feed store. Someone said you've been keeping company." Eli raised an eyebrow. "Rumors travel faster than storms around here." Claire laughed softly. "So it's true then? You've got a bobcat family living with you?" He hesitated. "You could say that. Mind if I see them?" He considered saying no. Old habits of guarding his world still tugged at him, but something in her tone disarmed him. It wasn't curiosity. It was care. "All right," he said finally, "but quiet. She doesn't trust easily." The barn was dim and warm, the smell of straw mixed with the faint musk of animal fur. Luna lay near the back, half watching, half dozing, the kittens curled beside her. Claire knelt a few feet away, keeping her voice low. "She's beautiful," she whispered, "and brave. Most wild ones would have run." "She did," Eli said. "Ran right into the storm. Then she came back." Claire smiled gently. "Sounds familiar?" Eli looked at her, puzzled. "What do you mean, you?" she said simply. "People talk about you the same way. Said you were gone for good. Guess storms have a way of sending things home." He didn't reply, but the words stayed with him. They sat in silence for a long while, watching the kittens play. The light through the barn window cut across the floor like a river of gold. Sometimes that's all healing needs, two people sitting in the same quiet, not trying to fix anything, just being there. Later, over coffee on the porch, they talked about small things, the price of hay, the dryness of spring. A fox that had been stealing eggs from her chicken coop. Eli found himself laughing real laughter, the kind that lifts instead of aches. It startled him at first. The sound felt too alive, too unexpected. But it fit. He noticed how natural it felt to share space again, to speak without rehearsing. Years of solitude had taught him how to survive in silence. But now he was learning the quieter language of companionship. As the afternoon stretched into evening, the light softened, and Claire said something that made his chest tighten. "You've done something good here, Eli. You gave those creatures a chance." He stared out at the horizon. "Didn't plan to. Just happened. That's usually how grace works," she said quietly. "It just happens." He thought about that word, grace. He hadn't heard it spoken in years. Out here, grace wasn't sermons or hymns. It was the simple act of keeping something alive, of staying when it would have been easier to walk away. Maybe that's all redemption really was, the courage to keep showing up for what's fragile. The next few days settled into an easy rhythm. Claire stopped by now and then, sometimes with feed, sometimes with nothing but conversation. They shared small tasks, patching fence wire, sweeping the barn, and feeding the horses. They didn't talk much about their pasts. They didn't need to. Each understood the other's silences. And in those moments, her pouring coffee, him setting out grain, the bobcat sunning herself in the doorway, life felt whole again. Not because it was perfect, but because it was shared. It reminded Eli of something his father used to say: "You can tell a man's soul by how he treats what can't give him anything back." Looking at Luna and her kittens, he finally understood what that meant. Compassion wasn't a performance. It was maintenance, a daily tending. The quiet visitors, both human and wild, had returned him to himself. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, Eli and Claire stood outside watching Luna lead her kittens through the tall grass. The sky burned orange and soft violet, the air humming with crickets. "She'll leave soon," Claire said softly. Eli nodded. "Yeah, they'll need to find their own way." He didn't sound sad, just certain. The way you sound when you've learned that letting go can be an act of love, too. Claire smiled. "You'll miss them," maybe he said. "But I think the land needed them as much as I did." The wind rustled the pines, gentle this time, carrying no threat, only peace. As night settled, Claire gathered her reins, ready to ride home. She paused at the gate. "Eli," she said softly, "if you ever get tired of talking to fences and bobcats, there's always coffee waiting on my porch." He chuckled. "I'll keep that in mind." After she rode off, Eli stayed under the wide sky. Fireflies blinked near the fence line. From the barn came the faint sound of purring, a small, steady heartbeat of life. He realized then that silence had changed its shape. It was no longer empty. It was full of memory, laughter, and possibility. But peace rarely stays untouched for long. Because the very next morning, the stillness broke again, not by the wind this time, but by the sound of something unfamiliar. Heavy boots crunching on gravel. Some visitors bring comfort. Others bring choice. Stay with me, because the next arrival on Eli's land will test the strength of everything he's begun to heal. Mercy is a strange kind of courage. It doesn't shout. It doesn't fight for applause. It just stands its ground when vengeance feels easier. That morning, when a stranger's boots crunched on Eli Turner's gravel path, he would have to choose between the man he'd been and the one he was becoming. The morning after Claire's visit was quiet, the kind of quiet that carries weight. The air was still, the light soft and cold. Eli was mending a broken hinge on the barn door when he heard the sound, footsteps slow and deliberate, coming from the road. He straightened, setting down his hammer, and saw a man approaching. Broad-shouldered coat, dusty hat, pulled low. There was something about the way he moved, confident, entitled, that made Eli's chest tighten. The stranger stopped a few yards away, eyes scanning the fence, the barn, the open field beyond. Then he spoke, the voice rough but steady. "You got something of mine, Turner." Eli frowned. "Don't think I do." The man's gaze shifted toward the barn. "Bobcat, female. Been hunting her for weeks. Cost me good traps, and I aim to get her back." Eli's hands curled slightly at his sides. "You set those traps?" The man smirked. "Ain't against the law, just business." "Not on this land," Eli said quietly. The man stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking. Listen, old man. You let that cat go, and she'll come back to me sooner or later. They always do. Wild things don't change. Eli's voice was calm but firm. She's got young ones now. You come near this place again and you'll find more trouble than you're ready for. The man's smile faded. You threatening me? Eli met his gaze, unflinching. No, just stating what's true. The air between them thickened, not with anger, but with something deeper. Two worlds colliding, one that took without conscience and one that had finally learned what it meant to protect. From the barn, a faint sound, the soft cry of a kitten, cut through the tension. The man's eyes flicked toward it, greedy recognition lighting his face. So, it's true, he said. She's here. Eli moved slightly, blocking his view. You need to leave. Or what? The question hung there. And for a moment, Eli saw the younger version of himself, the man who would have met violence, with violence, who believed justice meant matching cruelty blow for blow. But that version of him had died with his son. He took a breath, slow and deliberate. You're not welcome here, he said quietly. And I won't let you harm her. Not again. The man reached for something at his hip, a glimpse of metal catching the morning light. Eli's pulse spiked, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he spoke the words that steadied him. Mercy's not weakness, he said softly. You wouldn't understand that. Then, from behind them, another voice broke the moment. Step away, Wardell. Claire Mason rode up, the trail rifle resting across her saddle, her expression steady. Scout trotted beside her, barking once before falling silent. Didn't think you'd still be hunting here, she said. Wardell's jaw tightened. Cat's mine, Claire. You stay out of this. I might have believed that once, she said evenly. But trapping's one thing, torture's another, and we both know what you've been doing. She nodded toward the distant ridge. Game warden's on his way. I called him this morning. Wardell's face twisted, part anger, part fear. You don't know what you're talking about. Eli stepped closer. I know enough. For a moment, it seemed the man might reach for his weapon. Then he stopped. Something in Eli's calm unnerved him, the kind of quiet resolve that doesn't bluff. He spat into the dirt. This ain't over. Eli's answer came low but certain. For me, it is. Wardell turned, muttering curses as he strode down the path. The sound of his boots faded into the distance until all that remained was the wind. Eli stood there for a long time after Wardell disappeared over the ridge. The adrenaline drained, leaving only stillness. Claire dismounted, setting her rifle aside. You all right? He nodded slowly. Yeah, just tired, I guess. She looked toward the barn where Luna's shape flickered in the doorway, watching. You did right, Eli. Not everyone would have. He didn't answer. Because deep down he knew how close he'd come to doing wrong, to letting old rage take over, to repeating a life spent running from regret. Instead, he'd chosen something harder. Mercy. Not for Wardell, but for himself. It's easy to think of mercy as surrender, as letting evil walk free. But Eli understood now that mercy wasn't about the other man. It was about refusing to carry the same poison. The world was full of people like Wardell, hardened by greed or fear. You couldn't change them all, but you could stop them from changing you. Justice had its place, yes. But mercy was the quieter kind of justice, the kind that restored what violence had broken. He'd spent 15 years believing that strength meant isolation, that justice meant punishment. Now he knew that real strength was restraint, and that peace was something you had to choose again and again, even when no one else would see it. The land around him seemed to breathe again. The air smelled clean-washed of tension. A flock of birds lifted from the trees, their wings flashing silver in the morning sun. Luna stepped out from the barn, the kittens following clumsily behind. She looked at Eli for a moment, not fearful, not grateful, just aware. He knelt slowly, setting his palm to the ground. You're safe now, he whispered. She blinked once, then turned toward the fields, leading her young through the tall grass until they vanished beyond the ridge. Eli stayed kneeling long after they disappeared. The silence felt different now, not empty but sacred. It wasn't a loss he felt. It was released. There's a point in every life when the past comes knocking not to haunt you but to see if you've truly changed. Eli's reckoning hadn't come through violence or revenge. It had come through stillness, through the choice to be kind when cruelty would have been easier. For anyone who's ever lived too long with old pain, that's what mercy looks like. It doesn't erase the scars. It teaches you how to carry them without hurting anyone else. By late afternoon, the warden arrived and took Wardell's traps away. Claire stayed for coffee while the last light lingered on the hills. When she left, Eli walked the fence one final time. The wind brushed against his face, soft and cool, and somewhere far off a single bobcat's cry echoed through the valley, low, wild, free. He smiled. The sound didn't break the quiet this time. It completed it. That night, for the first time in 15 years, Eli slept without dreams. And when dawn came, the world felt lighter, as if waiting for him to begin again. Sometimes mercy isn't about what you let go of, it's about what you make room for. Stay with me, because as the light returns to Eli's land, he'll discover that even after loss, there's still something worth building, and still someone to build it with. Every fence tells a story. Some are built to keep the world out, others to mark where a heart was mended. For Eli Turner, the fence that once stood for solitude would soon become something else entirely, a reminder that even the most broken places can grow wild again. Spring came slowly that year. The snow melted into the soil, feeding the grass until the land turned soft and green. Each morning, Eli walked the same fence line he'd mended 100 times before checking posts, tightening wire, and more often than not, pausing just to breathe. The world around him had changed, but not loudly. It had changed the way healing does, quietly, one day at a time. The barn was empty now. Luna and her kittens had gone weeks ago, their paw prints fading from the mud like goodbyes written in earth. He thought he'd feel hollow when they left, but instead he felt something gentler, a kind of peace that had waited patiently for him to notice it. On the porch, he kept an old tin bowl filled with water. It wasn't much, just a habit he hadn't shaken. Now and then he'd see the marks of small paws beside it. Sometimes coyote, sometimes fox, sometimes... He swore it was a bobcat. He never tried to know for sure. Some mysteries he'd learned are better left unproven. They let you keep believing. One evening, Claire Mason rode over again, bringing a sack of feed and a basket of biscuits she pretended were just leftovers. They sat on the porch, watching the sunset turn the sky to fire. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked. Eli shook his head. "Used to. Thought I'd sell this place, head somewhere quiet. But then I realized quiet's not the same as peace." She nodded, letting the words hang between them. "You've done something good here, Eli. Not many people would have helped a bobcat and her young. Most would have just closed the gate and turned away." He smiled faintly. "Maybe. But if I've learned anything, it's that the world gives back what you give it. You show a little kindness sometimes, it finds its way home." The wind carried the smell of cedar and rain. A few fireflies blinked near the fence line, lighting up like tiny stars. For a long time, neither of them spoke. There was no need. The silence between them wasn't the old kind anymore, not the cold, lonely silence that once haunted his days. This one was warm, living, full of gratitude. Claire eventually stood brushing the dust from her coat. "You know," she said softly, "the fence looks different now. Used to seem like it was keeping everything out. Now it looks like it's keeping something, and something worth holding on to." Eli followed her gaze. The fence glowed in the golden light, the wood worn smooth by years of weather and work. He realized she was right. It didn't look like a barrier anymore. It looked like a boundary of care, a line that said, "Here is where life can begin again." The next morning, Eli woke before dawn. The air was cool, the kind that carried a promise of warmth later in the day. He poured himself a cup of coffee, the steam curling upward like memory, and walked down to the edge of the property. The horizon was just beginning to glow, a thin line of pink cutting through the dark. And then, as the light rose, something moved near the far fence, a flash of tawny fur, the unmistakable silhouette of a bobcat standing tall and still. he stopped walking. The cat turned its head toward him, eyes bright calm. They stood there for a moment, man and wild creature, both quiet witnesses to the same sunrise. Then, just as the light spilled fully across the land, the bobcat slipped into the brush and disappeared. Eli smiled. It wasn't sadness he felt, it was connection. For years he'd thought he'd lost everything that tethered him to the world. But now he understood that connection wasn't always about holding on. Sometimes it was about learning to let go gently with trust that what you love will find its way home. Standing there, Eli thought about all that had changed since that first morning when Luna appeared at his fence, bleeding and afraid. Back then, he'd been a man locked in his own silence, certain that the world had nothing left for him. But now, he could see how wrong he'd been. That single act of kindness, freeing her from the trap, choosing compassion over fear, had undone years of isolation. It hadn't just saved a wild creature. It had saved something inside him. He thought about his son, about all the words he'd never said, and somehow, through the stillness of the dawn, he found a way to speak them not out loud, but in the quiet rhythm of his heart. "I'm all right," he whispered to the air. "I'm home." The fence beside him creaked softly in the wind as if answering back. As the sun climbed higher, Eli walked the fence line one last time that day. Each post held a story of storms weathered, of creatures sheltered, of choices made when no one was watching. He realized then that fences don't just divide, they define. They remind us where we stand and what we stand for. In his younger years, he'd built fences to survive. Now he mended them to belong. The difference, he thought, was everything. He'd stopped trying to keep the world away and started letting it in, one small act of kindness at a time. A bowl of water, a hand extended, a silence shared. This land, these creatures, these people, they had all become part of him again. And in that belonging, he discovered something most people spend their whole lives searching for: peace that doesn't depend on what you have, but on what you give. That evening, as the light faded and the stars began to shimmer, Eli sat on his porch with his coffee cooling beside him. The night was alive with sound, crickets, wind, the faint cry of something wild far off in the canyon. He thought about how life had a way of circling back, how the same fence that once marked his solitude now stood as a symbol of grace. There would always be storms, there would always be loss, but there would also always be light and the choice to walk toward it. He lifted his eyes to the darkening sky and felt no fear, only gratitude. For the land, for the silence that no longer hurts, for the wild things that had taught him how to begin again. If this story spoke to you, if it reminded you of the strength that still lives quietly in the human heart, take a moment. Think about your own fences, the ones you've built to keep the world out, or maybe to keep yourself safe. Ask yourself this: what would happen if you opened a gate just a little and let something wild and healing find its way in? If that thought brings you peace, if it reminds you that kindness still matters, please leave a like, share this story, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more quiet, healing stories into the world. And if you'd like to go one step further, you can leave a super thanks or donate below. Every bit goes toward helping rescue and heal real wild animals, bobcats among them, who deserve the same second chance Eli gave. Because out here, every act of kindness ripples farther than we'll ever know.